In early 2025, the Trump administration shocked the world with a dramatic announcement that would send ripples through the global economy. The White House declared sweeping tariffs on nearly all imported goods, targeting products from Asia, Europe, and beyond. The move was sudden, catching both allies and rivals off guard, and immediately sparking confusion at ports and warehouses across the country. The administration argued that decades of unfair trade practices had hollowed out American manufacturing, shuttering factories and sending jobs overseas. The new tariffs, they claimed, would reset America's trade relationships and force foreign governments to the negotiating table. Supporters hailed the move as a bold stand for American workers, believing it would revive struggling industries and restore pride in Made in the USA. Rallies broke out in industrial towns with workers and local leaders cheering what they saw as long overdue action. But critics sounded the alarm. Economists warned of soaring prices for everyday goods, from electronics to groceries. Retailers and importers scrambled to adjust as supply chains buckled under the sudden changes. Fears of global retaliation grew, with trading partners threatening their own tariffs on American exports. In a controversial move, the administration bypassed Congress entirely, invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. Officials argued that the nation's ballooning trade deficit constituted a national emergency, justifying extraordinary executive action. This unprecedented use of emergency powers triggered a constitutional crisis. Legal scholars and lawmakers from both parties questioned whether the president could unilaterally reshape trade policy, raising urgent debates about the separation of powers and the limits of executive authority. Lawsuits from businesses, states, and trade groups quickly followed. Plaintiffs argued that the president was overstepping authority reserved for Congress, and that the sweeping tariffs threatened livelihoods and the stability of the U.S. economy. The legal battle cast a shadow of uncertainty over the economy. Businesses put investments on hold, unsure of what the future would bring. Small business owners, already struggling, faced tough choices as costs soared and customers disappeared. The fate of U.S. trade policy, and the broader economy, now rested with the courts. Judges across the country weighed arguments that could reshape the balance of power in Washington for years to come. As the nation watched anxiously, Americans braced for a historic showdown, one that would not only determine the future of trade, but also define the very limits of presidential power in a time of crisis. The administration's push for tariffs was deeply rooted in the belief that global trade deals, negotiated over decades, had systematically disadvantaged the United States. Trump and his team argued that these agreements allowed other countries to benefit at America's expense, eroding the nation's industrial base and costing millions of jobs. They saw tariffs as a tool to rebalance the playing field and restore American economic strength. Trump and his advisors pointed to the massive and persistent U.S. trade deficit as undeniable proof of this imbalance. They blamed a combination of foreign government subsidies, currency manipulation, and high barriers to American goods for the problem. In their view, these practices unfairly tilted the scales, making it harder for U.S. companies to compete both at home and abroad. The tariffs were designed to make imported goods more expensive, giving American manufacturers a better chance to compete. By raising costs for foreign products, the administration hoped to boost domestic production, protect American jobs, and pressure other countries to negotiate fairer trade deals. The strategy was bold, aiming to reverse decades of outsourcing and bring critical industries back to U.S. soil. The plan was sweeping, a 10% tariff on nearly all imports, with the threat of escalating to 20% if U.S. demands weren't met. There would be no exemptions, no matter the country or the product. The message was clear: America was done playing by old rules. The administration even threatened to impose duties as high as 50% on certain countries, signaling that no trading partner was immune from the new approach. This aggressive stance sent shockwaves through global markets and left foreign governments scrambling to respond. This America First approach marked a sharp and deliberate break from decades of bipartisan support for multilateral trade agreements. For years, both Republican and Democratic presidents had championed free trade as a path to prosperity and global influence. But the Trump administration saw these deals as outdated and harmful, arguing that they put American workers and industries at risk. Instead of seeking compromise, the White House chose confrontation, using executive action to bypass traditional negotiations and international institutions. The administration rejected international cooperation, opting for a go-it-alone strategy that prioritized American interests above all else. This was a dramatic shift, signaling to the world that the U.S. was willing to upend the global trading system if necessary. The ultimate goal was to force a global reset, one that put American economic sovereignty and self-reliance at the center of U.S. policy, even if it meant short-term pain or international backlash. The move set the stage for a dramatic and contentious clash over the future of U.S. trade policy, with consequences that would ripple across the world economy for years to come. To bypass Congress, the administration invoked IEPA, a law meant for true emergencies, not chronic economic issues. Historically, IEPA was used for sanctions or crises, not for rewriting trade policy. Critics argued that calling a trade deficit an emergency stretched the law beyond recognition. The Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to tax and regulate foreign commerce. By using IEPA for tariffs, the administration was accused of seizing Congress's core authority. Legal experts warned this precedent could let future presidents declare almost any issue an emergency to bypass Congress. Even some allies in Congress voiced alarm at the executive overreach. The move ignited a fierce debate over the limits of presidential power in a democracy. The battle over tariffs exposed a deep divide about presidential power. Supporters argued the president needed broad authority to act quickly in a complex global economy. They claimed IEPA gave the executive wide discretion to define threats to national security, including trade deficits. Opponents countered that the Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to tax and regulate commerce. They warned that letting the president use emergency laws for economic policy would erode checks and balances. Critics insisted IEPA was never meant for sweeping tariffs, but for targeted sanctions. The fight became a test of whether the U.S. would allow an imperial presidency or uphold democratic safeguards. Legal challenges to the tariffs landed first in the Court of International Trade, where judges quickly blocked the policy. The court doubted a trade deficit qualified as a national emergency and questioned using IEPA for domestic economic policy. The government appealed, but the Federal Circuit also ruled against the administration, citing executive overreach. With 2 losses, the White House turned to the Supreme Court. The stakes had grown. This was now about the balance of power between Congress and the president. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, setting up a landmark decision. The nation watched as the justices prepared to decide the future of presidential authority in trade. The outcome would shape American governance for years to come. In a historic decision, the Supreme Court ruled against the administration's use of IEPA for broad tariffs. The majority opinion affirmed that only Congress can impose taxes and regulate foreign commerce. The court found that a trade deficit isn't the kind of emergency IEPA was meant to address. Justices drew a clear line. Emergency powers can't be used to bypass Congress on major economic policy. The ruling cited the major questions doctrine. Big economic decisions require explicit congressional approval. The court didn't question the president's motives but focused on constitutional limits. The message was clear. To fundamentally change trade policy, the president must go through Congress. The era of using vague emergency powers for sweeping economic change was over. The Supreme Court's recent ruling didn't strip the president of all trade powers, but it did set important new boundaries. While the decision was significant, it was also quite specific in its scope, focusing on how the president can use certain emergency authorities. The decision was narrow, targeting only the misuse of IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, for imposing broad tariffs that affect entire industries or countries. The court made it clear that IEPA was never meant to be a tool for sweeping trade wars. However, the president still retains several important tools. For example, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allows the president to impose tariffs or other trade restrictions if imports are found to threaten national security. This authority has been used in the past for steel and aluminum tariffs, and remains available for future use. Another key power is Section 301 of the Trade Act, which lets the president respond to unfair foreign trade practices. After a formal investigation, the president can take targeted action, like imposing tariffs or negotiating settlements, to protect American interests. These powers are more targeted and require specific findings, not sweeping declarations. They demand evidence, investigations, and a clear connection to national interests, rather than broad claims of emergency. The court left these authorities untouched, but firmly closed the door on using emergency powers for massive economic shifts. This means the president can't simply declare an emergency to reshape the entire trade landscape. Going forward, future presidents must rely on established, limited statutes, or seek new laws from Congress if they want to make major changes to trade policy. The days of unilateral, sweeping action are over. The ruling rebalanced trade authority, ensuring that any significant shift in trade policy now requires legislative approval. This restores Congress's central role in shaping the nation's economic direction. The path for sweeping trade policy now runs through Congress, reinforcing the system of checks and balances at the heart of American government. The Supreme Court's decision brought immediate relief to businesses and consumers. Months of uncertainty ended, allowing companies to plan, invest, and hire again. For workers in import-dependent industries, the ruling prevented layoffs and cost spikes. While some hoped tariffs would revive manufacturing jobs, most Americans avoided higher prices on everyday goods. The court's decision protected lower and middle-income families from a regressive tax. It reaffirmed that only Congress can impose such broad economic burdens. The ruling shifted future trade debates to Congress, demanding public debate and consensus. Administrations must now build support for major trade changes, not act alone. The process is slower but more democratic and stable. The Supreme Court's ruling was more than a legal decision. It was a reaffirmation of American democracy. By blocking unilateral emergency tariffs, the court reinforced Congress's authority over economic policy. The decision wasn't about trade theory, but about upholding the constitutional process. It drew a bright line. The power to reshape the economy belongs to the people's representatives. Future presidents must engage Congress to enact major trade policies. This ensures diverse voices are heard and policies are more durable. The ruling guarantees that America's economic future will be decided through debate, compromise, and the will of the people.